Hello, everyone. Welcome to another lecture for English 2090 Online. We'll take a little bit time today to discuss metaphors, visual narratives, and so forth, focusing on a couple key terms like cinematography, but one kind of crucial term in terms of film studies that we'll get into. So let's, of course, break down a couple of the terms, right? Just make sure everyone knows or is familiar with these terms. Cinematography, what is it? Well, it's the art or technique of motion picture photography. And that's the kind of key issue, right? It's the art, right? We're focusing on craft when we're talking about cinematography. So the director and the cinematographer are both responsible for cinematography. Obviously, the director is the chief creative person, right, for the movie, also in charge of cinematography, but the director of photography, DP, or cinematographer is also in charge of, camera, lighting, electrical crews, and so forth. So as the director is plotting out scenes and so forth, or even if the director provides a really important kind of storyboard, the cinematographer will also be the one to kind of make that happen. So here's where we're getting with cinematography in terms of narrative. So telling a story on film isn't just about recording action, right? Anyone could hit record. What we're talking about when we get into cinematography is how the images are captured. So whether we're in television or film, we're thinking about cinematography in this way, right? What do we do with the camera? How do we position it? What angle are we getting at? How are we going to capture color or lighting or shading and all these things? What this does is it feeds into what we're going to be talking about in terms of visual metaphor. So, a metaphor, just to probably reintroduce that concept, I think we're all familiar with it, but in general, a figure of speech that compares an implicit, implied, or hidden comparison between two things that are unrelated, but which share some kind of common characteristics. In other words, a resemblance, right, of two contradictory or different objects is made based on a single or some kind of characteristics, right? Now, in literature and film, it could also be a figure of substitution. So we're going to substitute, right, one object for another. And so that's kind of an important idea. So let's look at a few metaphors in Macbeth, right? So we have a couple of key lines, right? Kind gentlemen, your pains are registered, where every day I turn the leaf to read them, right? What's the metaphor here? Well, memory, right? The metaphor of a book, right? Turning the leaf of pages is like flipping through images in one's mind, right? So all the pains are registered every day, right? And thinking about all the different kind of pains that people have, or sacrifices that people have made are weighing upon the king's mind, right? Like flipping through a book, right? Even just the out damned spot, right? So we have a metaphor here, right? Damned, right? There's the kind of double meaning there, right? The guilt of Lady Macbeth, right? And then the metaphor of the spot, right? Especially because it's in her head. And so, there's all these kind of metaphors that are happening within Macbeth. Most famous, of course, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, comparing an actor, right, the metaphor, an actor, to everyday people, right, living, right, performance and living, right, that's the metaphor. Same thing here when we get even thicker with Lady Macbeth, right? Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, take all my femininity away and fill me from the crown to the toe top full of direst cruelty, right? Make thick my blood, stop me from feeling pity so that no natural feelings can get in the way. Well, what's the metaphor here? Well, she's a bottle, right? So, she's trying to get the courage, right, to commit the crime against, right, the king. And so what is she doing, right? She needs, and of course we could look at all those kind of important aspects of taking away femininity, right? So she wants to be drained of any kind of empathy, sympathy, compassion, emotion, and just fill me with hate and cruelty, right? So there's that metaphor that she's a bottle. So, metaphors are, throughout literature, but then, of course, visually, they're in film. So metaphors, I think, are a lot easier in a way to discuss with literature, I would argue, because visual metaphors, while sometimes they can be pretty easy, they often are almost too easy that our minds kind of don't even think about them. So what concept we're talking about when we talk about visual narratives in film, we're talking about this idea called mise en scène. So, what is it? It's French for placing on stage. So it starts as a theater term because it's an expression used to describe design aspects of a theater or film production, which essentially means visual theme or telling story. So, when applied to cinema, mise en scène refers to everything that appears before the camera. We're talking about arrangement, composition, sets, props, actors, costumes, lighting, everything. The mise en scène, along with the cinematography and editing of a film, will influence that idea of the verisimilitude, right? The truth seeming, right, of a film in, of course, our eyes, right? The eyes of the viewers. So mise en scène expresses, again, the visual metaphors depicted in film that help enhance the film's characters, tone, symbolism, and themes. So we're talking about a concept of, again, cinematography, creating visual stories, visual themes, and of course, visual metaphors. Now, key aspect is that this is not a production term. So it's not like everyone is making notes, okay, we got to fix the mise en scène today, right? This is an analytical term. So again, you're never going to hear that mentioned on the, any kind of film crew, right? We're not going to discuss it, right? What we do is when we discuss it is when we actually start analyzing the visual representation. Right. So again, from the workers who build the sets to the CGI designers to the cinematographers, the actors, costume designers, directors, and so on, right? The mise en scène is the result of the collaboration of many film professionals. So it's not, again, this is why it's not a production term, because the editor could all of a sudden totally change it, right? What a cinematographer and director intend. Now all of a sudden an editor could crop things and so forth. So this is an analytical kind of term for when we start analyzing scenes, breaking them down, and so forth. So if we just take this brief shot, right, of Macbeth here, right? Again, think of just the mise en scène, right? Why is she in blue? Why is he in white and black, right? Why are they highlighted that way? How is the blood drawn to our eyes, right? How are his hands with blood shadowed? Why are her hands with blood pronounced where his aren't? And how is he looking at her, and how is she looking at the blood? All these things, the visual metaphor, right? Creating that mise en scène, creating that visual story, right? So we want to analyze, right? So again, same thing here, right? Just the costuming, right? Why do they look like communist Romanians, right? How does that play into our kind of ideas, right? Why are the nurses kind of, dressed the way they are? What the horror in this scene, the lighting, the shadow, right? All these things will help create the tone, right? Again, the nurses slash witches are menacing, right? Even just the green, we get a very drab, menacing color scheme. The lighting there's a lot of shadows. There are gates and things, and pay attention to that as a visual metaphor, right? So all these things, right? The costuming, the lighting, the way these nurses are, right? All, and then again the blood, right? Will create the tone, right? Will create kind of a grittier, darker tone, and that's what we're doing when we're talking about mise en scène. And it works too. Obviously, lighting and so forth will make an important kind of mise en scène and tone relation in Throne of Blood. So again, just look at how the witch here, right? The kind of spirit kind of person in this case, right? They're very bright, whereas our warriors are very dark. And so why is that? And how does that create kind of a creepy tone, right? Especially in terms of the house. And then, of course, we get the visual metaphor of the wheel, right? The spinning wheel. And so all these things now will create visual metaphors, right? The wheel of fate and so forth. And then, the darker kind of warrior versus the kind of light enlightenment versus sinister, revelations and so forth. So there's all these things, the lighting, the set design, the costuming that will affect the tone and how we view it as a movie, right? Even though this is black and white, it's still going to be a very gritty movie because of the color schemes. And so that's how mise en scène and tone work. Basically, I should be able to pull a specific shot and we can create and analyze, right, the visual themes going on, the characterizations, and so forth. So this is another one, and let's look at this kind of shot very specifically in terms of characterization, tone, and theme, right? Well, again, think of just how she as a performer is kind of making us feel a little disturbed, right? How is he looking that he's pondering? Notice the placement, right? So now our characterizations are thematically and visually, right, creating that dynamic between Lady Macbeth and then Macbeth. And of course, in our versions with Throne of Blood, right? So how is she, right? Why is she towering over him? He's kneeling, he's under her visually, right? So she's created and casted as the manipulator, right? Notice how, again, this kind of wall that's kind of closing in on him, right? Notice the background with her, very kind of odd, kind of painted wood and so forth that's dripping and like it's just creating a very an important tone, right, of disturb, insane, right, madness, right, all these things, right, are going to help create those themes, right, that why is Lady Macbeth mad? Is she mad from the beginning? Does her guilt catch up with her? All these things will create how we interpret these characters. So again, from the costuming, the placement of our actors' performances, and so forth, will create the ultimate mise en scène in terms of how these kind of concepts work with visual metaphors. Again, same thing, right? Again, notice the light, right? It's very dark except for our table, right? Our characters are surrounded by shadow and darkness, and think of that as a visual metaphor, a symbolism, right? The fact that, of course, the ghost, right? And everyone is usually dressed in either black, right, or black and white to show important contrasts. Notice again the idea that either everyone is all black, but there's white, and so again, that balance between good and evil, the fight between light and dark. Visually and literally, they're using light and dark to create these metaphors, right? To create these visual metaphors. So again, and same thing, notice again the use of kind of the splattered backgrounds, right? And how that will affect how we interpret the visual presentation, right? Same thing too with visual and theme, right? Our witches, right, in Gould's version, right, are they're nurses, right? And how are they sinister? How are they kind of playing off this metaphor that nurses should be helpful, right? That they should be here to help us. But how are they then actually driving the badness and driving the blood? And notice how they're always covered in blood, or there's always blood around them. So what's the visual metaphor, right? What's happening here with the visual metaphor, right? Of the witches, right? The nurses being part of the driving kind of violence and so forth. So what we do with the mise en scène, right, is again, well, no matter how I freeze frame a movie, the visual metaphors should be pretty clear. There should be some kind of symbolism or story slash narrative being told based on just one shot alone. And that's the kind of key concept when we get into cinematography, mise en scène, and all those kind of important ideas. Important ideas. I forgot to shut off my phone. So, concluding thoughts, right? So, mise en scène affords directors more opportunities to be artistic, and that's the kind of key issue, right? Whether the film is made for mainstream audiences or more avant-garde ones, right? We always want to think about each frame telling a story, each shot telling a story. The term, again, originates in theater. It's not until the 1950s when film critics and French film magazine Courrier du Cinema, I'm not great at pronouncing French, began using the term mise en scène when we're reviewing movies. It's now a crucial term for film studies. Again, we're not talking about production, we're talking about film studies. It's a crucial term for what we're doing right in this class since we're not making movies, to really help think about how directors and cinematographers create visual stories and metaphors in film. And that's the kind of key concept because, again, it's a lot of times it's easier to articulate a metaphor in literature because we see the comparisons being made, right? Oh, he's comparing life to theater. Oh, she's comparing herself to a bottle being filled, right? So the language a lot of times is easier to dissect and analyze when they're using metaphors in literature. Visual metaphors are a little bit more complex because it's blood, but it's not just blood, right? The blood symbolizes violence, the blood symbolizes madness, and so forth. So, it takes us, I think, a little bit to really work with these concepts at times when we're analyzing film. Obviously, if you have questions, keep posting them to the forum. If you need this in alternative formats, please contact ARC. In the meantime, just good luck with all the kind of tasks you have this week, and take care.